It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Joanne Smith. Joanne is president of Price to Profits Consulting, formerly DuPont head of corporate marketing and pricing, and author of 2 books. She focuses on helping B2B companies transform their pricing performance. At DuPont, she was instrumental in creating the pricing organization, which transformed DuPont from weak to outstanding pricing performance. So with that, Joanne, welcome.
Well, thank you, Nick. Let me just jump right on into this. So this is part 2, and I'm sure there are some folks on the line that were not in part 1. So give me just about 1 minute here to kind of recap and put us all in the same spot. When I talk about these 8 pitfalls, what I'm really talking about is when I go into client after client that have started their value pricing, many of them are frustrated and tend to have the same 8 pitfalls that I see routinely. So that's what I'm talking about. And at the end, when I normally come in, what I really feel from these companies is a whole group that is saying, geez, we've brought this in, but nobody's using it. We did a few, but it's not being used. Or they get so caught in the quantification and they can't get over the hurdle. Again, it hurts their ability to move forward. And then the last thing that I often see is, geez, we did a great value pricing, but sales was unable to do the negotiated price and get us that fair price. So it's those frustrations that I'm speaking to now. And the framework that I use when working with companies in value pricing through selling tends to be in the simplest form. Block 1, that I'll talk a lot about today, is all around value price setting. How do we set the right price? And then, of course, we have to use that to influence the perception of value. So we have to do some value selling, some value marketing. And ultimately, it has to get into our value negotiation on when we have power, what power, and how to make smart decisions. So here we are. Part 2 is all about the setting side. Last month I did part 1, which was, the downstream, the selling, the negotiations. And in fact, somebody asked me, why did I do part 1 as the back end? Why did I not start with the setting, the natural way we would do a process? And it was very intentional that last month I talked about how it was used with marketing and sales, because I wanted folks to see the end game. Because everything we do in the value setting is ultimately used downstream. And I just wanted the end in mind as we talk about some of the pitfalls that happen in the value setting that hurt our ability to effectively value sell. So here we are. We're going to talk the business approach, value articulation, the math, how to validate your benefits, and the share capture. And I'm going to warn you now, there is no rocket science here, right? Most of what I tell you is going to be small tweaks, perhaps, off of what you may already be doing, because I find in this particular area, the devil's in the detail, right? High level people get it, but there's many things they do that weaken their approach. So, good news is you should be able to pick up some practical tips that you can easily begin to use. So let me start with the approach that I like to use. I always start with a hypothesis-driven workshop where we are literally doing our best job to hypothesize, to guess, to estimate what that value price looks like. And it is so critical to do this before we do our market validation, right? Because if we do not do this first, I can almost guarantee you when I get to the how do we validate, you will not be as effective getting the information you need out of a customer if you have not already hypothesized the answer. So I will talk about that a little bit later, but it is absolutely a key approach. Then after we get more market knowledge, of course, we have to come back and refine our price setting, because clearly we will have guessed some things incorrectly. And so as we look at this, I like to use these in a workshop approach with a cross-functional team. So what I mean by a cross-functional team is generally no one person has the knowledge to really hypothesize well the benefit case for a customer. So I like to bring in what is often 3 to 5 players that can bring in enough of the knowledge that we do a really reasonable job at our hypothesis. So typically sales has got to be at the table. Typically when it's something new, technology, either the application development folks or the technical service folks add a really good component of information. And if your company has a product manager or a market manager, they may well have another piece and another view on the value. So those folks in the room, and if you're lucky enough to have a facilitator, something that knows value pricing that can lead you through that workshop, it's going to go either smoother and certainly better. So sometimes that might be a person in your pricing organization or in your marketing organization. So here's what I see quite often once the hypothesis starts or whatnot. When I'm looking back on things that I've seen other companies do, it is so typical for me to have them describe a particular product where they are literally giving me essentially 2 pieces of data. 1, the benefit, and 2, they've turned it already into the value in dollars per unit of their product. So, and by the way, when they say benefit, it is often a hodgepodge of their internal features, like higher purity, and true benefit, like less rework, as an example. So when I see this occur, I almost always can be 100% assured that they will not be able to talk through their value case, that when they try and actually explain it to me, they're going to confuse me. They're going to lose all credibility because they will not be able to easily talk about this case. And while it's not important for them to be able to talk to me, if they can't easily tell me, I can be pretty sure that the salesperson doesn't understand that value case well enough, and therefore that salesperson cannot possibly do a good job value selling that project. So that kind of shortcut causes that, but I will also say almost invariably it causes a math error. It absolutely causes difficulty in your validation, and the odds of you getting the customer to give you good feedback in the way you need is probably not happening. And third, and equally as important, is your ability to leverage, to then take whatever value story you did and take it to the next customer or the next segment is completely not going to happen or not effectively happen when we try and do this shortcut. So I am a real stickler for doing a 5-step, very distinct, you must answer in every box kind of a process. And that means I start with your features. My example here is enables better mixing. What does that feature do? The specific customer benefit, in this case, 5% less rework. Why, or the value driver, why should that customer benefit, why should they care? What does it really do? And a value driver, by the way, is always reduced cost or increased revenue, or the third choice, if it's quantifiable, is improved working capital. So what does it do? And then how much? We turn it into that financial dollars, and always first in the annualized or appropriate dollars for your customer before we then turn it into a value base on our product basis. So if we're looking at this, you're looking at the first block is in internal speak. The last box, $33 a pound, equivalents of our product. Again, internal speak. It's the 3 buckets in between that are so critical in the customer's vernacular, in their financial terms. And so I use a framework that I have folks fill out, and they need to have these pieces. And I'm just going to go through it a little bit deeper, if you will. Why do we even care about the internal speak of our feature? It's so critically important because when we tell a customer we have a benefit, we have to have them, we want to have them believe the benefit is real. And to do that, we have to say, well, there is something unique about our physical product or our service or something that should allow you to believe that we can do a different and better benefit for you than the alternative. So we have to tell them what's unique about what we have. So as we then speak to box 2, our customer benefit, they can actually envision this here, right? The benefit is in their terms. Value drivers, as I've already talked about, is to make sure they know how they make money and then ultimately how much. And again, pretty critical because depending on who we're selling to, most procurement people may not in any way really understand our customer benefit, right? It may be words to them. And if we don't explicitly say, when we do this benefit, when you get this for you, that means the operation has reduced cost by $200,000. If we're not able to talk in those terms, the buyer's likely to miss the story. So again, pretty critical. And if I bring this further, of course, in between value driver and value, we have to add the calculation. But first, let me just back up and make a comment around the feature benefit side. When I do this, it is not surprising with some groups and some products that we can spend 30 to 60 minutes trying to help them clear up and understand what is an internal feature and what is the actual benefit to the customer. So it sounds so darn simple, and yet I see these columns not used well often, and we often have to coach people through this. And if we don't, again, when sales goes to sell, they're going to be limited. Now, I'm going to talk about the math in a minute, but when I follow the format that I'm showing here, that makes it so easy for me as a third party to look and see, does their story hold water? Does the math actually connect to what they said the value driver and the benefit is? So that the story is very easily told and I can very quickly say, oh, that math looks right. I understand how you got there. So, obviously quite important. And then as I've already spoken on the last 2 boxes, we must first talk customer centric, total dollars, before we turn it into unit dollars, which is really more an internal talk. So let me do a little build up. The other thing that I see in this particular area as when we do it is when we have a more complicated value chain, when the value is not immediate from us, the supplier, to the next party, but it maybe goes 2 or even 3 steps down. So my little example down there is a supplier that goes to a converter, the converter to a brand owner. And if that value is out at the brand owner, then we have to first go to the farthest place of that value, the brand owner in our case, and that is where we will start the math, the little template, if you will, that says what's our feature, the benefit, etc., and how much does the brand owner save? Because in this case, it's $1 a pound. We then have to split that with the customer, and that will feed what the supplier and converter then get in terms of a higher price. So I like to see when we do this, actually do each one fully down, brand owner, to what premium we deserve as a value chain, then take, in this case, 50 cents, take that back into the next stage, do it for what we then get out of the converter, and back that up. So this is certainly an area I see folks kind of stumble on. All right, let's turn here to the math. And the math here, this should be the simplest possible area. And yet, invariably, I see, when I say, show me your math, I see no assumptions written. Often, I certainly see no units or only sometimes units used. It is not unusual for me to see somebody actually multiply dollars per ton by gallons because they haven't written out the units or consistently used them. They use bad formats that make it almost impossible to figure out and validate and ultimately to value sell. Clearly, if we do not do this math part right, we can't leverage it to the next customer, the next customer, the next segment. And of course, I often see folks do this that maybe aren't financially, have good financial backgrounds, and they may well treat and add, if you will, a one-time inventory reduction, a cash flow reduction, to an improvement in ongoing revenue. So we need to really look over their shoulders on the math side. And I'm not a big proponent on giving them a completely open field to do this in any way that they want, because when they do, I see all sorts of poor behavior. I prefer you use some sort of a template. Clearly, every case is different, so you can't have an exact template, I don't think. But a column that says list all of your assumptions, the units specifically, the math that allows us to figure it out so that we can then, in the green buckets, calculate the total benefit to the customer. It divides by the units of volume we sell them to put it on a unit basis. So pretty simple when I use a very clear assumption box. Here's a couple of things that happen. I'm actually able to literally show this to the customer if I want and not feel embarrassed about how it looks and what is in it. I am surely able to really easily modify it. As an example, if I decided the rework improvement's not 10%, it's really 12%, I can that quickly modify it. Or if I got the cost of rework wrong, I can quickly modify it. And for sure, I can tell that simple story. Somebody can quickly look over my shoulder and say, yeah, your math looks right, and your math follows the story of your benefits. So that should be, for sure, not rocket science, but almost never do I see it done unless somebody has forced the issue of using a level of a template of some nature and enforce the discipline of doing it well. All right, I'm now going to kind of switch to how much value should I capture, because this is another area that folks really get hung up on. And unfortunately, there's not an exact science, but there are some real rules of thumb that we can use. So I think everybody that's doing this knows that whatever is your added value, we have to split that in some cases. And I know that some folks teach, oh, use a 50-50 as your default if you don't know better. And that may well be a starting point, but I think that's even a little more optimistic. And I think it is much better to really do a disciplined approach. And I'll talk to that in a minute. What I do find, though, is I tend to have more customers that tend to want to give themselves 70-80% of the capture. They want to take almost all of it for themselves, and rarely do they deserve that. And every now and then I find the customer that's afraid to take anything. They want to give it essentially all to the customer, and maybe they'll only take 25% of that value creation. And often therefore, they're leaving money on the table. So here's how I kind of think about it. If I looked at all the value capture across, let's say, thousands of value pricing projects, I would say that the bulk of them are going to be less than a 50% share capture to you, right? It's not an equal bell curve. The default of 50%, which almost sounds like 50% of the time it's below and 50% it's up, is not really the way I see it go out. And let me talk to you about maybe when you can get 50% and when you can't. And then we'll talk about the other side. Pretty much to get 50% or even more, we have to have the customer believe in the certainty of the benefit. They absolutely have to believe that they will get exactly what we say or better, right? And they're very confident of that. They also have to believe it is immediate dollars. As soon as they start using that product, automatically they get, let's say, the yield improvement that we talked about. They also have to believe there's not risk in switching to us, or they don't have to invest in equipment or changes or qualifications of any substantial nature in order to be able to use our product. And then one other feature might be fairness. So at the end of the day, when we calculate that price, if it just seems so out of whack that just, your gut says it's not fair, we're going to probably have to back it down some. And that may happen with certain areas where you really have an enormous benefit, maybe an IT software solution, and you're just an enabler, and it looks like you've just tripled the earnings of the company. Well, you're clearly not going to be able to get a huge piece of that. The whole fairness would come into question. So what more often happens on why we're usually slightly less than 50% or significantly is the customer doesn't fully believe 100% that your value prop and that they're going to get it. They might think other customers got it, but there's something different in their operation, or maybe you haven't proved it sufficiently, and then you're going to get less. Or it may take time. If your product helps them, as an example, sell their own product at a higher price, well, that doesn't happen day one. That's going to take them time to get their product out into the marketplace and get credibility for it so they can begin to move price up. So when it's delayed, we're going to get less. When there's downside, there's risk, there's switching cost. It's a multi-year payback for the customer. Or again, fairness. It just doesn't feel fair. Even with your best story, it doesn't feel fair to the customer. We're going to get less than 50% share. So here's a couple examples. On the right side, when do we often get 50 at least, maybe more? Often we can do this with a yield improvement, or when we can say you will use less of our raw material, less of our product. We can often prove it to them and it's immediate, they can see it, and therefore we can get a higher share. Or if we help them reduce their internal cost, their processing costs, that's more likely to be at least a 50-50. Or in those rare cases when we're lucky enough to have a not only very unique, very valuable kind of solution, but pretty much the only game in town, then clearly we can get that 50 and likely quite a bit more. But what normally happens, the downside, anytime our value prop is we're going to enable them to grow more at higher price, you're going to probably get less. Or the value creation is a joint effort between us and the customer. They didn't just use our product. Their technical folks, our technical folks also had to work through it. You're likely to get less. Or when we provide technical support through the year, that's likely to have added pockets of improvement, yet we're likely to get a bit less for those sort of things. And for sure, if it is very non-unique support, it's more like just a service that anybody could do. We just happen to do for them, like regulatory certification or something. We're going to get less of the total benefit of what that certification could be because it's more of an activity than a true unique value creation. So here's how I like to do it. I like to use, and I actually use a little bit more of an in-depth, this is kind of a simplified version, but I take those varying factors and I tend for every benefit to have the client I work with them to really rate, is this something favorable to us or unfavorable in the eyes of the customer, right? And I go from a 0 up to a 1 to a 2 or negative to a -1 to a 2. So I begin to see which ones of those are working against us, which ones are working for us, right? That are more of in our value story. And I use this to really help me judge, do I get more than 50 or not? I will just say as we begin to use this in a more mathematical field, I do not equally weight the sort of things that you see here in the factors, right? And those weightings that I do may vary by a particular customer situation. But in general, certainty of benefit and speed tend to be amongst the higher ones. So I usually do a kind of more of a weighted average when I actually do this out. And I use it as a guide, not the end all be all to mathematically decide. But the discussion is very rich and it usually allows us to get to what is truly a fair sharing where we don't take too much or not enough. All right, so let me switch to the probably one of the toughest is how do I validate this, right? And usually there's a lot of fear in the organization. They're uncomfortable trying to ask customers. They absolutely believe the customer will not tell them anything or very little. And almost all of them have some experience where they've tried to get data unsuccessfully that kind of makes them believe this, makes them uncomfortable. And so they're really stymied. They don't move forward. So how do we get over that? And I'm going to talk a little bit about this and give you an example in just a minute. So let's start left side. Clearly, if we're trying to get validation through the buyer, through procurement, they're just trained to tell you pretty much nothing. So you want to get beyond the buyer to the people who actually appreciate and get the value in the organization. And if you have multiple customers you can go to, avoid the price buyer. He's unlikely to tell you anything, and he's also unlikely to value it as much. So try and go to the customers where you have better relationship, who are already more open with you. Now, dropping below that, we often default to only sales going out and getting that data. And yet I find that often if we rely more on the technical resources or marketing resources, they have access to different people that are often closer to where the value is actually created. And a technical person to a technical person is often much more open. But the second sales walks in the door, they kind of equate sales with the person that's going to set price, and they tend to close up. So often it can be more difficult for sales to get the information out. The other thing is sales shows up, procurement often insists on being in the room if sales is in the room. And then again, you're kind of shutting down the conversation. Let me jump to the far right. To do this, you have got to be comfortable with tension. Most of us, probably about 75% of us, tend to be more diffusing tension. We always want the conversation to be nice. But when we do this, and by the way, when we do this and we do any kind of sales, we have got to be comfortable putting a level of tension very respectfully into the conversation in order to get what we need. And I'm going to give you an example in just a moment on that. I'll come back to it. Bottom right, we do not need exact data. We just need to be in the ballpark. right? So we don't have to get hung up if they didn't tell us it's exactly 98%, right? As long as we know it's 95 to 100, we are probably good enough to have a value price and a value conversation later on. And of course, not every assumption needs to be validated. We have to hone in onto the most important ones that we are uncertain on and that are big enough to be really meaningful that the customer is going to really drill in on. So we pick those key ones. Now let us go to the green boxes. I often hear customers say to me, or excuse me, suppliers, and I ask the customer what price they would pay, and they wouldn't tell me. This step is not about asking what a customer would price. That is not the question. We are only asking about the benefits. It's fully benefit focused. Later on, we will do our math to figure out what they should pay. But it's all about what is the benefit. And when we do this, if we only use open-ended questions like, you know, what do you value? How much would you pay for that benefit? Open-ended questions, if you're lucky, it'll work. More times than not, it won't. And this is where we go to hypothesis-driven questions. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But this is why my approach that says we got to hypothesize first what we think the answer is, so that when and if we need to turn to hypothesis-driven questions, and I suspect that you will, we can do it effectively. So let me just give you the most simple kinds of things. Here's the supplier saying to the customer, yield is important to many of our customers. Is it to you? So that's a little bit of a hypothesis-driven. And if the customer says, oh, yes, very much so. And the supplier says, well, how much is your yield loss? Okay, kind of open-ended. Not unusual for the customer to say something like, well, I'd rather not say. I can't tell you that. Something that kind of shuts us down. If we're not comfortable with tension, right there we stop. Right? They wouldn't tell us, we stop. But if we are comfortable with tension and we've learned to do it respectfully, we might say, and this is where we're going to use hypothesis. Well, gee, many of our customers indicate their yield loss is in 10 to 20%. Does that seem right for you? And in this case, the customer might say, well, yes, it's in that range. So where he wasn't willing to tell us what it was, he's now, because we put a hypothesis, able to say, well, yeah, you're at least in the ballpark. And does a good sales or technical person stop there? No, they might use their hypothesis to drill even further. In this case, great, it's in that range, but are you likely to be more at the higher end or the lower end? And here the customer might have answered the higher end. So by understanding where we're going, every time they don't tell us something, we can come back in a very nice way. And it is amazing how often when you do this, that a customer who would not typically tell you anything will actually respond to a hypothesis that you put out first and tell you and give you indication that gets you closer and closer to the value you need. So that's just kind of a little snippet to give you a sense. All right, so once we've done that, we bring our little cross-functional team together. We refine our pricing based on all of that new input. The only thing I would add here is some groups at this stage forget to add the strategic issues. So you can do all this great work, but you need to test other things, like with that value-based price, is it big enough to fully cover your cost at a margin? Even if the return on your, and I've seen this one before, we do this great value price, it has a great return on the customer, but then we find out, or I find out, that there's a huge investment needed by the customer. If you have very cash poor customers that can afford to invest in a big thing that's multi-year. Even if the total ROI is great, you're going to still have a hurdle that's going to stop your ability to get to market. You might have ceiling prices where if you get too high, it looks great versus the alternative, but suddenly the alternative switches. It's suddenly, instead of buying a polymer, this whole customer is going to jump way over and they're going to start buying metal parts, a completely different alternative that maybe you didn't calculate for. So we have to understand when there's ceilings, or I've watched customers do this, and they have contract limitations. They went through it, they decided, my gosh, I could raise price 20%. And then they look at their contract and they've written in a 5-year contract that only allows 3% increase per year. So make sure you look at some of the other things to be sure you don't have additional things you have to work out. All right. So if that interests you and you want to learn a little more deeply on any of this, there are some online courses with the Professional Pricing Society where you can take those online and pay by the course. I offer a couple geared for, one for sales, one for marketing in this space. I am also running ISBM is hosting for me to lead a 2-day training session really targeted for marketing and sales folk in Pittsburgh in about 2 weeks. And you can see a link below if that's something that is of interest to you. All right. So with that, I'm going to turn that back over to Nick.
All right. Thank you, Joanne, for sharing your insights, not just during this session, but also during part 1. So we've had a few questions come in during the session, and there's still plenty of time to enter your question into the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. So just as a quick reminder, while you're entering, please complete the 10-second survey while exiting today's webinar to be entered into the raffle for 1 free copy of the Price Negotiation Playbook. So with that, I want to give everyone a couple more minutes to enter your questions. And I'd also like to introduce Brian Hannon, who is our Vice President of Sales here at Leverage Point, who would like to say a few words about what we do.
Great. Thanks, Nick. And hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. So for folks who may not be familiar with Leverage Point, we are a cloud-based software company, and we have a value platform that does many, and actually most of the things that Joanne just discussed. So our customers use the platform to think about, to quantify, and to communicate value. And I'm going to show you in a couple minutes here a quick demonstration of that last piece, that value communication. So as I mentioned, we're a cloud-based platform. So what you're seeing here is a value proposition or value story. And this is one of our demonstration examples for a fictitious company called Airventus, who manufactures high-end air conditioning equipment for data centers, essentially keeping the servers cool within a data center. So what you see across the bottom are a number of tabs. You can kind of think about what you're seeing here as similar to a PowerPoint presentation, but there's 2 key differences. The first is that we have a value calculator that's embedded in the presentation, and you'll see how that operates in a moment. The second key difference is that we focus on the value story. So this isn't necessarily a product presentation, it's more of a value discussion, again, similar to what Joanne just went through a few minutes ago. So as I click through, typically with a value story, we're starting to discuss the key areas of economic impact that our product has on our customer's business. And we start at a qualitative level. So you can see here there are 3 main value drivers: energy, a reduction in energy usage, a reduction in downtime, and a reduction in required maintenance. And all of those have benefits to the customer. Then we start to get into some of the numbers. And the way we approach this is to view this particular slide as almost a case study. So as Joanne alluded to, you want to draw the customer out in terms of a conversation. And if you can show them some baseline data, and maybe you explain to them this is what other customers are seeing in terms of benefit, and then you allow them to provide feedback and maybe make some changes to that, you start to gather data during that conversation. And so our example here, and maybe we're speaking with Boeing today, and we explained to Boeing that for a data center of roughly 800,000 square feet, paying this much for energy, we were able to save that company almost $400,000 in costs. Now, Boeing might tell us that their data center is actually much bigger. It's 1.2 million square feet, and they're paying more for energy in that part of the country. So as we have this back and forth with the folks at Boeing, we start to get a clearer picture of the potential value we could deliver Boeing if they go with our equipment. So here we're making a fairly bold claim. We're claiming that if they go with our more expensive equipment, we can save them almost $1 million a year in costs. So we need to be able to back that up. So you'll see the next 3 slides actually go into each value driver in more detail. So here the goal is to explain our logic, our thinking, how we came up with these numbers, and potentially make some changes again based on feedback from the folks in the conversation. And if we're effective at explaining the logic behind each value driver, then the actual specific numbers become a little less important. If they agree with our thinking, they can always change the numbers now or at a later date. And the focus on having everything exactly right goes away. And again, that's something that I heard Joanne say, and I totally agree with that. So after we go through each of the value drivers, we may show a chart like a total cost of ownership. Leverage Point provides all different types of charts and graphs that we use to help you tell the story. And again, these numbers can be changed at any point as well within the conversation. We might start to get into a discussion about price. And so we want to potentially show the customer that, yes, we realize we're more expensive, but we've also done the math for them to show them all the savings that they'll receive. So we can actually show the customer the value that they're receiving and show them our price and help them understand that even though they're paying more upfront, they'll see a significant benefit over time. And of course, we could show a traditional waterfall chart to do the same thing. So once we've had our conversation, we can save this back into the cloud. So each opportunity or each deal that salespeople are working on can have its own unique value proposition. And then I can even click and download a PDF or a PowerPoint directly from the screens that we just created. And now we have a record of the conversation that we had with Boeing, and we can send this back to Boeing, and now they have a record and they can share this internally, hopefully moving our deal forward or getting us higher in the organization. So that was my goal in a few minutes to show you an example, and hopefully that worked out well, and I'll pass this back to Nick.
All righty, thank you, Brian. And I'm going to take control back. So if anyone found that interesting, please feel free to enter our monthly raffle where we will digitally transform one of your case studies free of charge. So just check the corresponding box in the exit survey upon leaving today's webinar, or you can just email us at casestudies@leveragepoint.com. Alrighty, so now it's time for the Q&A. And so we have a bunch of really good questions that have come in over the course of the session. So Joanne, let's start with this one. Some teams use statistical techniques like conjoint analysis and other approaches. Is more than one approach incompatible?
Well, no, I don't think they're incompatible, but not always necessary. Let me just go right to the conjoint, because I definitely see that occurring where we use something like that, and perhaps a discrete-based conjoint. You know, would you rather buy this product at 10 cents higher or this product at something lower? So conjoints can be particularly good when we have a lot of emotional kinds of value, things that are very difficult to quantify, which we see in the B2C space quite often. But conjoints and any other type that essentially ask the customer, what would you pay for this? Often the answer is a little bit less than what is actually the reality. And particularly in the B2B space, because in the B2B space, they often can't truly appreciate, picture the new innovation that we have. And if you haven't really owned it and used it, it's very hard to fully value it. So B2C side, when we can quantify, we're going to get a much better value-based answer. Plus, we will get all the data behind it that allows us to tell the value story, which can be very difficult, where a conjoint really doesn't help us so much tell the value story. So I do, however, like conjoints when we're really thinking about segmentation, and we have a number of different segments, say very price sensitive buyers up to value buyers, or really technology brand buyers, to think about what are the kinds of features that might be attractive to these different segments, so that we understand there is a whole segment that just loves technical service and training and auditing, and there's another segment wouldn't pay anything for those, so that we can begin to come up with a segmented offer that we properly do our value price around. So that's how I might use those other techniques.
All right, great, thanks, Joanne. So next question. So you discussed earlier breaking out value between supplier, converter, and brand owner. How do you assign value where, and who gets what percentage of the value?
Right. So let's just take the brand owner. Let's say that's the third place in the value chain, right? I look at the benefits delivered there, and I do the actual sensitivity analysis that I talk to, right? What's for the brand owner? What's the chances that they 100% certain they're going to get it? What's the speed, etc.? And I figure out what is the fair split to the brand owner. What's left then has to be split between ourselves and everybody else downstream of the value chain. So then I have to say, okay, if the supplier's got 50% or the brand owner, that leaves 50% for me and the converter. Now I kind of have to do that sensitivity analysis thought process for the converter to figure out how much I leave with the converter and how much I take. In general, in that particular case, maybe the converter adds almost zero value. They're just taking what we did. They do have to price it higher so that it moves on. So their only step may be upping their price. So they're adding very little to the mix, and it's very easy for them to add the price. Then the odds are I'm going to take 80% of that value, maybe even 90, depending on, how big it is. I am probably not going to take 100%, right? Because that converter still is in the value chain, and I'm going to share in some way so that they feel that it's also a positive that I have now switched my products, and now I'm asking them to sell something different. I'm asking them to sell a value story, which takes more energy, more effort. So I'm going to give them a piece, but it's going to be a small piece unless they actually had to do something to add and create a piece of that value, right? Like blend it with something else or whatnot. So that's how I think about it.
All right, fantastic. So we do have a question asking for a little more clarity on earlier slides. So when you're showing the probability charts, and I think that was the one with the distribution analysis, showing more or less than 50% of value capture, what units and axes are you using on those charts?
So when I talked about 50% value capture, I'm actually talking about whatever you decided the customer value is. Let's say it's $1 million. Do you keep 500,000 and they keep 500,000, and you're going to price it back? So it's really a percent of the total value. How do you split or not? right? And if that's the question, if you really looked at that little drawing where I was trying to pictorially show how often, what percentage of the time can we capture 50% or more, I'm illustrating that probably, 70% of the time it's going to be at best 50% or less. So it's not, that is more an illustrative drawing that just says, right, if every time you do a value-based case and you're like constantly thinking you get 50 to 70% of the share and the customer gets a little small piece, probably you're being a little greedy. Probably you're over capturing is really more the point.
All right, thank you. And I think we have time for one more. So I think we'll go with this one. So who in an organization should validate? Is that just something you leave to the consultants?
All right, so I talked a bit about, who should validate. And, really, at times sales can do it, but at times they're really not the right person. Now, can we use a third party to validate? Certainly, they're very neutral, and often a third party is really skilled on how to do it if we've done the hypothesis first. So that's an option. But I do find in many, many cases, your own force, your own technical or sales or product manager, or maybe you even have a Six Sigma black belt that's skilled in this way, can absolutely do many of the cases. Right. And then if they go technical person to technical person, as an example, or marketing to a commercial business lead there, they can do, I think, a fine job. Every now and then, it's complex enough, it's important enough, and you need to really come at it with a neutral party. And then a third party can be a great opportunity to get even more data.
All right. Well, thank you, Joanne. And before we go, I would just like to take the chance to give a little shout to next month's webinar. So we're really excited about this one. So we're hosting a customer panel entitled Initiate and Scale Value Selling, a live webinar panel discussion. And we'll be hosting a panel of leverage point customers, and they'll be discussing their experiences introducing and implementing value in the sales process. And you can see our panel right there. And the webinar is going to be on Thursday, June 27th. So make sure you register, and there will actually be an opportunity to pre-register in the exit survey upon the end of this webinar. So that's it for us today. I just want to thank you all for taking the time to join us, and a special thank you for Joanne for not only today, but also joining us last month as well. From all of us here at Leverage Point, have a wonderful rest of your week and take care.